Oh, compromises.
Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to CLS Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering the Compromise of 1820, otherwise known as the Missouri Compromise. As you well know, hopefully by this time in class, the United States government has been founded upon and still really relies on compromises. That's what goes on. You always hear today in the news that the Senate and the House of Representatives have to, they come up and pass a bill and a plan, and then the Senate comes up and passes one that goes along with it, and then they have to compromise to find the middle passageway to make an agreement. Three-fifths compromise, great compromise, Missouri compromise. We are going to cover so many compromises because that is the basis of American government. And here is one of them, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and it is trying to control slavery in the United States. That's what this compromise is all about. In 1819, Missouri meets the requirements to become a state that were set forth in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They had the population, they had enough people who own land, they had enough people who could vote. Let's do this. Let's become a state. Missouri would have entered as the 23rd state, and they would have entered as the 12th slave state. There's right there on a map right here. Right, so here's the map of slave states, slave-owning states, and the map of free states. So if Missouri came in as the 12th slave state, and there would be 11 free states. So here's your debate. If Missouri comes in as a slave state, this causes an imbalance in the Senate. And what that means is that the slave states would outnumber the senators of the slave states, or representation. Remember that R word that we've talked about before? The representation in the Senate would have favored the South. So if there would have been any type of laws or acts or amendments that had to do with slavery that was presented to the Senate, it almost certainly would have passed. And that would have been detrimental to our nation. So there's your debate. What are we going to do with Missouri? They can become a state, and they want to become a slave state. What do we do? So we have an amendment that is proposed called the Talmadge Amendment. And this was shot down in the Senate because of the number of slave and free states. Remember, Missouri was coming in as the 23rd, which means you had 11 states that were free, 11 states that were slave. And this amendment was an anti-slavery amendment. It was put there to restrict slavery in Missouri, make it so any slave, once they reached the age of 25, they were no longer slaves. So it passes the House, fine. It cannot pass the Senate because, again, they had equal representation. At least if it's equal representation, the amendment dies. There's nothing you could do about it. Nothing can be changed. So here's what the North, or the free states, the abolitionist states, here's the plan that they come up with. Massachusetts, if you remember going over the 13 colonies, Massachusetts was that small area, which it is today, but it also controlled a lot of land in the northeastern part of the United States. They broke off that territory because it also met the requirements to become a state, and that area becomes Maine. So now Maine comes in as the 23rd state before the slave state of Missouri, and it becomes the 12th free state. So now our free states outnumber our slave states, which allowed Missouri to then come in as the 24th state and as the 12th free state. That is the Missouri Compromise. Missouri enters the Union as a slave state, and Maine enters the Union as a free state. Basically, what the Missouri Compromise does is it puts a Band-Aid over the gigantic gushing wound of slavery. Slavery was important to the economy of the South. They felt that it ran their way of life. They needed the slaves in the South to be able to harvest the tobacco and later the cotton. That's what the South felt. So the Northern abolitionist states were like, we cannot let this country become a slave country. It's wrong. So they take this gigantic gushing wound, and with the Missouri Compromise, they put a Band-Aid over it. And they say, hey, that's how we're going to solve slavery. Every time basically a state comes in, we'll just have to make sure that there's a free state. So those two states come in, but how do we solve the problem of slavery in the future? And here is what they came up with the Missouri Compromise of 1820. There's a map right there on your right-hand side. And as a matter of fact, if you look at a U.S. map today, you will see that there is a very distinct line towards the southern part of the United States. That's really like our slavery scar, you can call it. What that line did, then that's the 3630 line. And what that did would say this is going to be the dividing line between free states and slave states. And here it is. That 3630 line, if you were a territory that was going to come in later to become a state, if you were above that line, you were to enter as a free state. And if you were below that line, you would be able to enter open to slavery. You would be able to have slavery if you wished. So if you look at the line itself, I think the northern abolitionist states felt that, oh yeah, I mean, we're going to get a lot more states out of this top above this line than they do on the bottom. So hey, slavery question is solved. And once all those places become states, we'll be able to vote slavery out and everything will work perfectly. However, if you look, and you'll see later on, we're going to cover this later on, what does this 3630 line do to California? Well, it splits it. So we're going to have to come up with this, we're going to have to revisit this Missouri Compromise later in 1850 when California is trying to become a state. So remember, the Missouri Compromise, we're trying to solve the representation in Congress. We're trying to settle the debate of slavery. Maine becomes a free state. Missouri becomes a slave state. And how do we decide slavery afterwards? We decide it by the 3630 line. And basically, again, if you're a territory above that afterward and you want to become a state, you'll become a free state. And if you are below that line, you're open to slavery if you wish to have it. All right, so that's the end. That's the Missouri Compromise. So go ahead and review what we just went over, which is the War of 1812, the Monroe Doctrine, and the Missouri Compromise. Study up and take your check.